So in this Python tutorial we're going to have a go at completing the averages challenge. Now the averages challenge is to make a program that asks the user for a series of numbers until they either want to output the average or quit the program. And then you've got the extensions, which is to expand the program to print the median and mode averages also. Now include options so that if the user wants to, they can save the list as a text file, which can then be read back later on. Now in this video we'll focus on just the averages, so make a program that focuses on creating numbers, so we'll store them in a list, and then output the average and allow the user to quit the program as well. So there's a couple of useful programs that we might need to use. One of them is called list and append. Now this is a series of code that allows you to have a list. So lists are basically a variable that is stored using the square brackets. So I've used capital L here. If you use the lowercase l, list is actually a function, so you need to make sure that you've got an uppercase if you're using list. And then we've got our square bracket here. Now because there's nothing in there, it's an empty list. So if I wanted to add something to my list, I can just do 10 for example. Let's do 45. You can add string to these as well because lists allow you to store any series of information. So I could add a word there for example. Now notice that the items are split and separated using commas, so that's how they are separate items. Now what I can do is run this, and a list isn't really any good unless you can actually add something to it. So part of what my code does is it asks the user to input to enter a number, and then this converts that data type, so whatever they enter, into an int, because I want it to be a number within the list. So if I then entered a number like so, you can see that it's got 90 and it's added those into there. So it's added to the list, and to add to the list you just put the list variable, so whatever the name of your list is, so mine's list, and then dot append, and then in brackets you put the variable that you want it to add. So it's quite simple, quite easy to add things to a list, and then when you restart the program again it will have the same list again, so I could choose a completely different number. So remember that those lists are kind of temporarily stored within your computer's memory and the RAM, and then when you close the program they're not saved anymore. So that's part of list. We will also need to have a look at loop, because we're going to need to use loop because we need to let the user add more numbers to the list until they want to exit basically. So if I've got loop equals true, and then while loop equals true, it's going to print hello. So if I ran this, it will just print that forever. It will never stop, because true will never change here. So you can change this so that within here you could do loop equals false. If I then run that, you'll see that it runs it and it does it once. Because what happens is it loops through, so it goes, prints that, and then it changes that to true, so from true to false, which then means that it's no longer equal to the value true, so it ends and breaks the loop. So that is a way to break out of a loop. You can also use the keyword break. So if I then run that, you'll see that it runs it once and then breaks it. So it only does it once. So that's another way of doing it. If we've got calculate average as well, because we're going to have to know how to calculate the average. Now to calculate the average, the easiest way to calculate an average is to have the total value divided by the amount that there is. So if in my case I've got 2 plus 100 will give me 102, it will then divide 102 by 2 because there were 2 elements within that list. So I've added them up together and then divided by 2. So if I run that, it gives me 51. So 51 would be the average of that set of data because there's only 2 values. If I then added another value, for example, so 150, I would then need to divide it by 3 so that it then gives me the average, which would then be 84. Now you can check that using a calculator, but we know that's going to be correct. So now what we want to do is I'm going to create a new file so that we can start working on this averages program. Now what we want to do is we're going to start off with a variable that we're going to have as our stored numbers. So we can have it as numbers or stored numbers. You can choose what you want to call it. I'm going to do stored numbers. Let's call it stored numbers. And then I've got capital S and then capital N just for the second word, so that we can see that it's a different word and it's easy to read. And then I've got equals and then just the square bracket. So that square bracket is the start of my empty list. It's good to have a welcome message to the user. So maybe welcome to the averages calculator. Like so. And there. It's also a really good idea with your programs to again have 3 speech marks at the top, just to explain to people what this program's for. The averages, average of a list. So if I do it like that and then 3 like that. It's just good just to show people that as soon as they open the program, what is this program for? It's like a mini introduction. And then we've got our variable here, so stored numbers, and then we've got welcome to the averages calculator. Now when we're creating this, we want it to be able to store something within that list before we do anything else to it. So let's start writing that bit first. So let's do input. So we'll add an input for the user. So what number should be added to the list? Okay, you want this to be very obvious to user, and then just put a space at the end there, because then when you run this, it will have a space at the end as well. We'll save that as a variable. So let's save it as number to store. Now I write quite long variables just so that you can see exactly what I'm doing. You can use much shorter variables. You could save that as just NTS, for example, so numbers to store. But I'm just writing them a bit longer so that you can see exactly what the variables are and what they do. As you're going through as well, don't forget that you can use the hash symbol so that you can then write what this does. So asks user for number to add the list. So that's asking them for a number that you want to add to the list. So quite nice, quite simple there. Now what we then want to do is we want to actually add that number to the list. So as we saw with the list.append, so let's have a look at that again. So we've got list.append, and then I'll bring up my other one. So we've got list.append to add it. So we can actually use that now. So stored numbers dot append, and then we'll choose what we want it to add. So numbers to store. Okay, so in the list. So as the number to be stored in the list. Now it's a good idea, again, as we've done in previous videos, to actually check that that's working. So let's do stored numbers like so, and then run that. So I'll just save that. Averages test, and then we get our message that's printed that correctly. And what number should be added to the list? Well, let's say we want to add 50. Let's do 90. So you can see that it's added it to the list there. So that's part of the list there. Now what's happened is it's added it within speech marks. Now the speech marks, we know that is a data type string. So what it's done is it's taken what's entered here and gone, okay, that's a string. Now you could always write here that numbers to store, let's do it above, numbers to store equals, and then int numbers to store. So, and then if we run this, so if I did 90 again, what will happen is it will convert this basically to an integer, to a number. What we can do though, a nice easy way, and an easier way to do it, is to actually just add it to the start here. So if you do int, add a bracket there, and then int hit, and then add your bracket here. When you run that this time, and I do 90, you can see that it's got rid of those speech marks. So what happens is that whatever the user types in there, it takes it as a number. So it means that that will always be referred to as a number when it stores it in the list. So it's actually already stored as a number, and that's really useful for adding up, because you can't add strings together because it sees them as any value, whereas if you store them as an int, it means that it is a number, which means that it can then be used. You can also do float. Now, difference with float and int is that float is a decimal, so it will be 0.0 if it's a whole number. So if I did that and I did 90, then you can see that it's 90.0 because it sees it as a float, which means that it is not a whole number. So I'm just going to keep this for int for now. We can obviously change that later on, but we're going to do that for now. So we've got it so that it asks them once to add a number to the list. Okay. Now what we really want it to do is to loop this. So we're going to add our while loop, and we can call it something simple. I tend to use something called loop. So if I said while loop equals true, and then a colon, and then tab, 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 so everything that you want to loop is tabbed, and then we need to have our loop variable up here so that it actually starts with true, otherwise this won't loop for the first time. So this will just loop. So if we do this and test that that loop is working, brilliant. Okay, so it's added one number, and then it adds another number and another number. Now if you added the same number, you can see it just adds the same number again, so it still allows you to add the same number over and over again if you wanted to. I could add 100 again. Now what we need here is the user to have an option to decide not to add another number, and that is where we're going to put an if statement. So we're actually going to have that if the number to store equals, let's say, no, then it could change the loop here and it will break this loop. So if we said if numbers to store is equal to no, like so, then it's going to break out of the loop. And then we're going to do a colon here. Now I've added these brackets, and I'll show you why in a minute, why we're using those brackets. So let's say print the loop is broken, so that we know. And let's say, yeah, the loop is broken. So the loop is broken. Now to actually break the loop, we need to change that value. So loop is now going to equal false, and that should break the loop, which means it should print this and it should end our program. So let's check that, make sure that that's working. So 100, yeah, yeah, yeah. Now let's type no. Now let's see what's happened. As you can see here, when we run this, we get that error that comes up. So we can put the numbers in quite happily, but if we then do no, it is not an int, so it doesn't recognise that as a valid response. So what we want to do is, just to fix that, this is one of the ways you can do it, is we're going to add another part of this function here. So if I did new number equals input, now this is where the user is going to input if they would like to add a number. So if they want to add a number, if we do it like so, what this will ask them is, would you like to add a number? And then we're going to make this so that it creates an if statement, so that if they do want to add a new number, so if new number is equal to yes, then what we can do is run that program basically. So if it's equal to yes, it means that it's going to take that response. So let's add our bracket there. So if this is yes, then we want it to run this part of our program. And then we add an elif, because if it's not equal to that, so if the number is actually equal to no, then it will break the loop, and it should give us a response that says the loop is broken. So let's change this numbers to store here to new number, and let's try running that. So would you like to add a new number? If I said yes, then it comes up and we can see that it's gone down to the right part here where we can then enter our number. Would you like to add another number? Yep, and let's do 100, and then let's say no here. So now we can see that it has broken the loop. It's also a really good idea to put an else function here. Now the else is basically to protect your system, so that if someone enters something that isn't what you've asked for, it will say that is an invalid response. So that we can make sure that they're only entering what we expect. So if I enter something random here, it will come up saying that is an invalid response. So then, would you like to enter a number? Yes. Enter the numbers, etc. So we can work the way through. Now we've managed to get to the stage that we've got it so that it's adding to the list. Now, really, when we say no, we want this now to start calculating what the actual average is. So what we can do is we can use a function that will add up all the numbers in that stored list. So what we do is we do sum, which is basically summary, which means add up everything. So sum stored numbers, like so. So they are already stored as a int already, so they're already integers, so they're already worth a value, so they can be added all together. But to be able to calculate the average, you need to be able to divide by the amount that there is. So what we can do is we could add length here, and this allows us to use a new variable which is going to be the length of the list. Now there's two options. You can do it as a variable here and you can get it to add the length of the list, or a much quicker way to do it is we're going to divide this by length of stored numbers, like so. And then I'm going to put that in brackets, and that in brackets, and then I'm going to call this variable average. Now the reason I want to call it average is so that I can then get it to print the average. So it should take the sum, which is the total, the stored numbers, and then divide it by the length of the stored numbers. So let's see if we've got that correct. So would I like to add a new number? Yes, please. So we've got 90. Let's add another number. Let's add one more number. Let's not add any more numbers. So we've got our response there. So let's go for, so we had 90 plus 200 plus 300. So we should have a total of 590. And then there's 3 elements there, so we should divide by 3. So let's divide by 3. And then 196, yep. And then what it's done is it's missed off the last one there. But it has given us the average for what we've been asked to do for that challenge. Now, we could then have it so that our system exited here. So it calculates the average once, and then you can just use exit and it will exit the program afterwards. So if I then did yes, let's just check that this all works. Ooh, add another number. no. And then you've got yours that's come out there, and then we would just do OK when we're ready to exit. So we can see the response, and then we can close and exit. You could add a sleep function in there if you wanted to give your user some time to see it all before they exit out, but that is the basic principle of the averages function. Now the one that I've created looks a bit like this one. So my one, which looks very similar to what we've created, the only difference is that I've also used slightly different variables, but I've also used OR. Now the OR is so that you can accept a capital Y or a lowercase y for yes, and also an uppercase no or a lowercase no. You could also add another OR to accept the letter N, for example, as you went through, but it's important that you're comparing what it is, what variable you're looking for it to be equal to. You can't just write OR and then no, for example, because what will happen is it will just accept all the responses that you put in there. So this is an example of what I've created. And I hope you found that useful, and it's allowed you to kind of work your way through it and to understand the task a little bit more, because we've managed to complete that challenge. And then in the next video we'll have a look at how to expand it to print out the median and the mode averages as well.